This is not breaking news. This is not a scandal. This is not about one person. This is about something quieter, more efficient, and far more dangerous. It's about how power behaves when it believes time is running out. Not tomorrow, not next year, now. What you are watching is not chaos. It is order, a specific kind of order designed to function briefly in the dark. When information disappears, violence accelerates. Not because the world doesn't care, but because the system can't react fast enough. And that delay, measured in hours, sometimes minutes, creates a window where rules no longer apply, but responsibility still exists. If you're still here, stay with me. Because once you see how this works, you'll start noticing it everywhere. This story doesn't begin with crowds or weapons or speeches. It begins with control quietly changing hands. And that's where we need to go next. When people look at moments like this, they search for a face, a name, a decision maker. That instinct is understandable. And it is exactly what the system relies on. Because what actually controls the situation now is not ideology, not loyalty, not even fear. It's timing. The system that matters is the one that decides how long reality is allowed to be visible. Who can speak? Who can record? Who can count? Once that system flips, everything else becomes secondary. Courts follow, media follows, diplomacy follows. By the time statements are written and meetings are scheduled, the outcome has already been shaped. This is not a breakdown of authority. It's a refinement of it. Power no longer needs to persuade. It only needs to outpace verification. And when verification slows down, force speeds up. That imbalance doesn't announce itself. It just quietly takes over. Which raises the next question, the uncomfortable one. How did this become normal? Because it didn't happen all at once. And that's where this really starts to get dangerous. There was a time when shutting off information was considered an act of desperation, a last resort, an admission of weakness. Now it's procedural. Before, power feared being seen. Now it plans for invisibility. What changed wasn't technology. It was tolerance. Each blackout was described as temporary. Each restriction framed as necessary. Each delay explained as caution. And slowly, the idea took hold that silence was a security tool, not a warning sign. Before, violence created outrage first, explanations later. Now, explanations are delayed until outrage expires. By the time numbers emerge, attention has moved on. By the time images surface, context has been diluted. And by the time accountability is discussed, the moment has passed. Nothing here feels sudden. That's the point. The most dangerous systems don't arrive like emergencies. They arrive like updates. And once people adjust to the update, rolling it back becomes almost impossible. Which means the real question isn't why this happened. It's why it was allowed to become repeatable. Because once a method works, it doesn't stay isolated for long. And that's what comes next. There is a moment in the material where everything changes. It happens quietly, between one night and the next. The injuries are different. Doctors notice first. They always do. What had been dispersed force becomes concentrated. What had been crowd control becomes battlefield medicine. Not theory, not speculation, observed patterns, surgical reality. Hospitals flood faster than records can be kept. Staff runs out before casualties do, and the shift is so abrupt that it leaves a signature. This is not panic. It's instruction, a withdrawal, then a replacement. A handoff from policing to something else. The system doesn't call it escalation, it calls it stabilization. And here's the part that matters. This transition only works if the outside world can't see it happening in real time. That's why the lights go out first. If you're still watching, stay with me, because this wasn't the crisis. This was the proof that the mechanism was active. And once it activates, it doesn't stop on its own. Here's the part that rarely gets explained. The system doesn't rely on chaos. It relies on segmentation. One force steps back, another steps forward. Responsibility fragments just enough to blur causality. Orders move vertically. Damage moves horizontally. And by the time consequences surface, the chain looks incomplete from the outside. The people absorbing the violence are visible. The people authorizing it are procedural. That gap is intentional. It allows the system to claim deniability while maintaining control. Admit some deaths. Contest the scale. Delay the count. Meanwhile, the cost is distributed downward, to families, to hospitals, to communities forced to grieve quietly. The benefit moves upward, time is gained, momentum breaks, fear recalibrates, and externally the response stalls because economic pressure moves slower than bullets, diplomacy slower than funerals. This is how the mechanism survives scrutiny, not by hiding everything, by revealing just enough to stay functional, which means the next phase was always inevitable, because once a system proves it can do this once, it tests how far it can go. And it doesn't test gently, then it accelerates. Arrests multiply, not selectively, broadly. Language hardens, labels replace names, process replaces judgment. When people are reclassified, timelines disappear, trials become optional. Outcomes become immediate. The system doesn't need to explain itself anymore. It just needs to move faster than resistance can reorganize. Externally, pressure begins to form. Statements are drafted, consequences are announced. But enforcement lags, always does. Because global systems aren't built for speed. They're built for coordination, and coordination takes time. That delay becomes strategic space, a place where executions can be scheduled before negotiations conclude, where fear can be locked in before leverage arrives. This isn't a breakdown, it's optimization. The moment authority realizes it can outrun reaction, it stops slowing down. And once that realization sets in, there's no incentive to de-escalate. Which brings us to the part of the story that finally touches you. Not emotionally, structurally. This is where the system reaches you. Not because you are involved, but because you are part of the delay. You live inside institutions designed to respond carefully, to verify, to debate, to proceed responsibly. And under normal conditions, that restraint is a strength. But when violence is compressed into darkness, caution becomes a vulnerability. Every hour spent confirming is an hour absorbed by people who cannot wait. Every procedural pause is felt somewhere as permanent loss. You don't see it directly. You see summaries, statements, filtered images that arrive after the outcome is already fixed. And you are told this is distance, geography, complexity. It isn't. It's latency. If this matters to you, don't look away yet. Stay through the end. Because what's being tested here isn't sympathy. It's whether systems like yours can still function when speed becomes the weapon. And that question doesn't stop at borders. It expands. Once this method proves effective, it doesn't stay contained. Other governments notice, not the speeches. The timing. They study how long visibility can be interrupted before pressure becomes unavoidable. They measure how much force can be applied before markets react. They watch which responses arrive first and which never arrive at all. This is how a local crisis becomes a template. Economic penalties sound immediate. They aren't. They require alignment, enforcement, endurance. Meanwhile, the internal damage is already done. Trade doesn't stop overnight. Energy flows reroute slowly, and countries with insulation, partners, or alternatives gain room to maneuver. That space is all a system like this needs, because once the cost of action becomes negotiable, violence becomes manageable. This isn't about one region anymore. It's about whether global pressure can still move faster than domestic repression. So far, the answer is uncertain, and uncertainty is not neutral. It favors whoever is willing to move first, hardest, and in the dark. Which brings us to the only part of this story that hasn't been decided yet: the future. From here, the system has three possible paths. The first is adjustment. Visibility returns slowly. Pressure accumulates just enough to change tactics, not behavior. Violence becomes less visible, not less real. The system survives by adapting its methods. The second is erosion. Leaks increase. Defections multiply. Control weakens unevenly. Not a collapse, but a thinning, where enforcement still exists, but certainty does not. This is the most unstable phase because everyone senses the balance shifting, but no one knows when. And then there is rupture. Not reform, not transition, a break. When speed stops favoring authority, when darkness can no longer be maintained, when internal fear outruns external pressure. None of these paths are clean, none are guaranteed. What matters is this: once a system reveals it can operate this way, it cannot unlearn it. And once the world learns it can happen, it cannot unknow it. The future isn't waiting to be chosen. It's already being tested, quietly, in real time, and the outcome will depend on which systems see themselves clearly enough before they are forced to. This is not where the story ends. It's where it stops being theoretical, because nothing you've heard requires a villain, or a speech, or even a trigger moment. It only requires one assumption to remain unchallenged, that systems built to respond carefully will always have time. They won't. The danger isn't that this happened, it's that it worked. It worked long enough, quietly enough, and efficiently enough to suggest a future where visibility is optional and accountability arrives too late to matter. You don't need to decide how to feel about that. You just need to notice it. Watch how often darkness appears before force. Watch how often reaction trails reality. Watch which systems benefit from delay and which absorb the cost. If you want to understand what comes next, don't stop here. Follow the pattern, not the headlines, because this model is still being refined. And the next time it activates, it may not look like this at all. It may look familiar.